And Mr. Arnke back with you again with CTI 120. We are migrating into our third unit here with chapters 9 through 11. So we're going to get into chapter 9 today with network risk management. Now we've got 5 primary objectives. We're going to identify people, tech, and malware risks. We're going to talk about some tools that are used to evaluate network security. We're going to talk about some physical measures that we use to both detect and prevent intrusion. We're going to configure devices on a network for increased security and describe various security policies, as well as a little subcategory here of explaining how security policies can guide user network activities. So let's go ahead and tackle that first subtopic with identifying risk. This one is subtitled People, Policies, and Products. So security risks has a lot of terminology. So of course we want to make sure that we're using terminology correctly so that we can identify how to communicate things to one another. I always tell students this, if you don't have the right vocabulary, it's very difficult to communicate what it is that you mean. A hacker originally meant someone who masters the inner workings of computer hardware and software in an effort to better understand them. And as such, they were able to perform certain actions to bypass security. Now, hackers are basically described as individuals who can gain unauthorized access to systems. This doesn't mean necessarily that they did it themselves. They can be the dreaded script kiddie who can use scripts to run things like that. A lot of hackers will actually write their own scripts in order to automate things. The way that you see it in movies is not accurate at all. It's not somebody sitting there rattling away on a keyboard. It's actually setting up a tool, going ahead and doing some recon, and then going ahead and allowing it to run automatically in order to perform whatever intrusion or testing or whatever else you've got going on. Now there are some different categories, of course. We have what are called white hats, black hats, and gray hats. White hats are security experts who are hired by organizations to identify vulnerabilities internally and externally. So they want to say, we have a service that relies very heavily on exterior online presence, or we have data that could be very dangerous if it was compromised. So we want to make sure that our internal and external traffic is always going to be correctly partitioned. These are usually called ethical hackers. That's actually the category that I fall under. When I was working on my master's, I actually got my ethical certified hacker certification. Certified ethical hacker, excuse me, let me get the terminology right. And the idea is that you have to have a very strong moral compass about this stuff, because there's a lot of things that you can get into that would be very dangerous on systems where people do not take a great deal of care with their electronic entry and exit credentials or whatever you have. There's a lot of stuff that they just kind of post willy-nilly. A lot of people think that for some reason, because a phone fits in your pocket and stays with you, that the data that's on it is secure as long as it's not hooked up to a desktop or something similar. And that's simply not true. Black hat hackers, of course, are the opposite. These are groups or individuals who will go in and cause damage, steal data, compromise privacy, and just utterly wreck someone's system. Now, this could be for some people would find it amusing. Some people enjoy creating disruption. Some people do it for financial gain. Some people do it for political ideology. There's a ton of different methodologies that are there. Gray hat hackers, as you might imagine, are a blend between white and black. They abide by a code all their own, and everybody in the gray hat community has a slightly different line. So they may engage in illegal activity, but the idea is they want to educate and assist. So there are hackers that will perform black hat actions, but do so for white hat reasons. So it's important to understand hackers exist on a continuum. Now, again, some of that terminology, we're going to bring it back from more of the earlier parts of the semester. Vulnerability. This just means there's a hole, a weakness in the system, a weakness in a process, or even in the architecture itself. There are exploits for the USB architecture, the physical architecture of USB that can be used to manipulate. Exploits are just taking advantage of a vulnerability. 0 days, which are no fun at all. The idea is that this exploit or this attack is being carried out because it has been 0 days since the developer has become aware of the vulnerability. So some 0-day exploits stay 0 day for a while until the the developer kind of gets their acting gear. Now this happens a lot, of course, with open source software, simply because a lot of the time the source code is out there for everybody to see. So if somebody finds a vulnerability, they know exactly where in the code it is and how to trigger that vulnerability so they can exploit it. So if that becomes commercial software or becomes integrated into commercial software, that can definitely be an avenue in which zero-day exploits can become present. Now, malicious and determined intruders may use just one technique. They may have something that they use as kind of a battering ram to get in the door. But once they're in the door, this can then allow them to start deviating a little bit. They can start using a second technique, which then supports a third, and so on and so forth. Part of the process of ethical hacking is maintaining access control, making sure that you can stay in. So if you get in by means of elevated permissions, for instance, you may want to find a way to modify an existing account or create a temporary secondary account that you can then pivot to in order to maintain access and keep from arousing suspicion. People, of course, are fallible. We know this, but we have to find ways to work around that. So that's why, you know, we have to look at the triad of security, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we also have to look at how to work with people. More than half of all security breaches are considered to be caused by human error, ignorance, and omission. Now, a really easy way to cause a security breach through ignorance is by becoming a victim of social engineering. Social engineering is just manipulation of tendencies of people to fall into line, you know, certain levels of conformity. You know, sometimes if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. But in some cases, it just means that they've got a really good disguise on. So these are strategies that can be employed in order to gain someone's password or other credentials. Now, common types of social engineering that we might see would be things like phishing, which you can see in the graphic on the right. The idea is that you go into this email. It has all of the livery that we expect to see, all the logos and indicia and fine print and all of the disclaimers that we expect to see. But something is not quite right about it, and it's just how skilled you are at seeing where the quote-unquote not quite right is. Then essentially, if somebody bites on that bait and they click through, then that is going to trigger some kind of capture of your credentials or take you to a page where you would enter privileged information. At such point, then if you updated your credentials or changed something thinking that you were on a privileged page, you would essentially have just handed your credentials to the attackers in question. Baiting is very similar. That's usually how Trojans go about. So somebody will put out like a torrent or a cracked file of some kind of utility that would normally be very costly. Adobe Photoshop used to be a very common target for this before they went to a subscription model. Quid pro quo, tailgating, all of these things are means by which we can try and manipulate people. Quid pro quo is I do something for you, you do something for me. Tailgating is where somebody just tries to use someone else's credentials to get inside the door, sometimes electronically, sometimes physically. The most important defense against social engineering is awareness and people training. So you want to talk to people as much as possible about what looks like a weird email, what seems suspicious. Sometimes you'll run into what's called an insider threat. This is someone who has been trusted by an organization, and they may either have or develop malicious intent. And what I say here is malicious intent is not necessarily like mustache twirling evil, that kind of thing. It's not like a Snidely Whiplash sort of deal. The idea here is that they either become greedy or disillusioned with the company, or for some reason, they no longer feel that acting in an ethical manner is beneficial. They feel that for whatever reason, they can subvert the authority or information that they've acquired to try and gain greater benefit of some kind. So how do we reduce these insider threat risks? Well, of course, as any company you've ever worked for has done, you get hit with a background check. They always want to make sure that you haven't gotten fired for stealing or for hacking or for bank fraud or anything like that. You also want to make sure as an administrator that you establish very quickly the principle of least privilege for all your users, regardless of how high up the tree they are. Even if somebody is like the CEO of the company, they don't necessarily need to have completely unfettered access to everything in the computer system. That doesn't make sense. That's what they hired you for as an IT administrator, right? So the principle of least privilege says they only need certain permissions to be able to do their job. So if they have permissions beyond that, we need to curtail that access. We also need to put in checks and balances on employee behavior, meaning that maybe for certain things it takes 2 people to authorize, especially for things that are really critical. Again, the example of the CEO. Maybe for financial decisions, both the CEO and the CFO have to have authorization on a particular item. You have to have a sign off from both of those people. DLP, or data loss prevention, can come in the form of different solutions. These are usually going to be automated systems that will analyze data, identify it as sensitive based on criteria that it's been given, and will prevent it from being copied or transmitted off the network. So certain files may have permission modifications that don't allow them to be copied to a local drive or copied to a flash drive or emailed away, things like that. Sometimes it can be as simple as just having a watermark that is added. When I worked for a particular electronics retailer a couple of years ago, whenever we would get information for our Black Friday sales, the PDF that we would get would generate from a link that you would click when you were logged in, and then your employee number would be stamped across it. And it wouldn't be so obnoxious that you couldn't read the content, but there was not really any comfortable way that you could go through and scrub all of the visual perceptive information that was there, not to mention the fact that there would have been almost certainly an electronic fingerprint present as well. So DLP can take a lot of forms. Now, this is a heavy slide. There's a lot of material here, but that's because there's a lot of inherent risks in hardware and design that we have to be aware of as technicians. First off is one of the easiest ones to deal with because it's one of the things that people assume is not as big a deal as it actually is, which is MAC spoofing. Your MAC address, Media Access Control, is the physical burned-in address of your interface. So if you have a wireless network card, if you have a physical NIC to where you plug in a cable, things like that, that address is supposed to uniquely identify your device on a global scale. So if somebody can impersonate that, then there's some things that can be done in order to try and intercept traffic that should be going to you, but instead is going to an attacker. So impersonation of this kind is very, very dangerous. Thankfully, there's a lot of challenge materials that we can set up in order to identify by more than just the MAC. That's why the OSI layer has 7 layers, right? Denial of service. Now, denial of service has many, many flavors. Standard denial of service is just where a flood of broadcast pings, or what's called the ping of death, gets sent out, and that will essentially flood all of the inbound access ports of a particular service in order to prevent them from being able to handle legitimate traffic. For certain businesses, this is very difficult to carry off because they have a lot of redundancy or protections of this type. But for other businesses, maybe something a little smaller or maybe something that doesn't have a great online presence, you might be able to carry it off pretty easily. But hackers are not, they're not big on putting all their eggs in one basket. So often they end up doing what's called a distributed DOS or DDoS. This is where you have distributed denial of service performed by use of what are called zombies. Now, zombies in the tech world are computers that are infected by some kind of control software. It could be a virus, could be a worm, any number of things. Usually going to be a worm, because if you do it through a virus, viruses can't really respond to remote control, so there has to be a secondary download that happens or some other trigger. So a worm is going to be your primary. Once that's done, and that computer has this infection, it can sit quietly for years, decades even, until it's ready to respond to a particular ICMP signal from a control host. That ICMP signal comes through, and all of a sudden the zombie wakes up. Now the zombie is able to carry out instructions based on predefined definitions that are given by the host. So this means that tens, hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of computers can work in concert in order to try and take a system down. And here's the really insidious part about a DDoS. Because they're all coming from legitimately identifiable MAC addresses, and they're all over the place. They could be all over the world even. it's very difficult to determine whether or not something is just a surge in traffic or if it's a DDoS trying to occur. We can make this even worse for the intended defender by using what's called a reflector enhancement. That's a DRDoS. This is where we're going to bounce the DDoS attack off of uninfected computers by using them as proxies. Then we can move to the target. Now, in certain cases, proxies and VPNs may have their IP addresses or blocks of IP addresses identified and make it more difficult for that particular access point to work, but that doesn't mean that it's foolproof. In tech, nothing's foolproof. There's always a workaround. There's always another way. We can also keep traffic a little bit quieter so as not to arouse suspicion, and this is what's called an amplified DRDoS attack. So again, we're getting longer and longer as we move forward, but amplified, distributed, reflector, denial of service. Now let's break down what this means. Amplification is the process of making something that is relatively quiet louder, if we talk about acoustics. So we're taking something small and making it large, but we're not actually amplifying the request. We're amplifying the response. So we're going to use small, simple requests to try and trigger very large responses from the target. Permanent DOS attacks are very dangerous. This is where device firmware starts getting messed with, and you end up with devices that are bricked. Now, you may remember this from a previous lecture, but the idea is if you brick the firmware of an object, it makes it to where it's irretrievable except under very specific circumstances. There are hardware experts and repair techniques that can be employed for this, but generally once something has been bricked, it's considered to be dead. It's not usable any further. Friendly DOS attacks exist. This is where a DOS can occur without malicious intent. So you can actually have DOS attacks that accidentally trigger. This happened a lot to the actor George Takei when he first got his personal website going instead of having his own page on Facebook. He actually had a redirect to content that he would host so that way he wasn't, crashing other people's pages, because he kind of underestimated, hey, somebody found something interesting on the internet, they forwarded it to me, I posted on my page, now millions of people are looking at it. And this person is hosting their video on a website that, maybe gives them 50 gigs worth of bandwidth a month or something like that. And they accidentally get taken offline. You'll see this happen all the time if you see an alert from companies like Cloudflare that will say that the bandwidth has been exceeded or the website is currently down due to traffic or things like that. Happens all the time. So there are definitely non-malicious DOS attacks that can be carried out. Another thing we have to be aware of is ARP, so Address Resolution Protocol. Remember, this is going to resolve an IP address to a name, an FQDN, fully qualified domain name. Now, ARP relies on responses from various servers in order to carry this out. So if the tables have been modified, then we can have some serious problems. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong part of my notes. What I'm talking about is DNS. DNS is going to be resolving IPs to an FQDN. What I'm talking about with ARP is where we have the port on the local switch going to your MAC address. So ARP and DNS spoofing are very, very close, but DNS is going to be on a remote system. ARP is going to be local. Man in the middle, MITM. This is where we have somebody who is trying to intercept your transmission and use it to capture your credentials, trying to manipulate. You'll end up with what are called CSRFs, or cross-site request forgery. You may see what's called XSS, which is cross-site scripting. You may see SQL injections in this way, but the idea is your traffic is going to an external site, right? So if I log into, www.mybank.com and I'm trying to log in to check my balance or things like that, if somebody can get in between me and that website and they can observe or manipulate the traffic as it's moving, then they can modify what I'm seeing as well as what my bank sees. So if we have an insecure connection, that can cause problems. Rogue DHCP servers. DHCP, of course, is Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. It allows us to automatically configure a device so that it can connect to our network and be able to access resources as needed. Now, if we have a client device that's connected that has a modified DHCP server on it that is outside of our control, which is why we term it as being rogue, This could be used to implement man-in-the-middle attacks, because if they're connected to our network but are routing traffic through themselves, this could allow them to manipulate the traffic that's coming in and out. And if they can capture enough traffic, they may actually be able to capture enough initialization vectors, or IVs, to be able to break the protection on our current transmission type. DHCP messages should be monitored through what's called DHCP snooping. This is an option that's built into a lot of switches these days. So if you don't have that active, you may want to go ahead and look into it, especially if you're at a corporate level. Then when you deal with sticky MACs and port security, fiber channels, things like that, in order to make sure that a switch knows how to perform the correct option with our data. Another one that's a little bit sticky is what's called a deauth or deauthentication attack. This is where frames can actually be faked and then transmitted to your AP, your client, or even both, to try and trigger deauthentication, to where your device would say, I'm no longer connected to this AP and I need to disengage my traffic. Once that happens, if somebody tries to reconnect at that point, somebody knows that new clients are trying to come in and can try and capture those beacon frames and probe frames. There are some protocols and services that we use all the time that are actually insecure unless we have a level of encryption involved, like FTP. FTP, File Transfer Protocol, does not have encryption as part of its protocol suite. We have to use SFTP at that point, or FTPS. You can use either arrangement. HTTP, which we use for websites. We can then put HTTPS for HTTP Secure. Telnet, which we know for remote access, does not have any form of encryption. We have to add that as a third party or an additional layer service. SLIP, TFTP, SNMP versions 1 and 2 all have insecurities that can be easily manipulated by an external client through means of very basic scripts. There are also what we call backdoors. So if we know a particular program is possessed of a particular flaw, as I said earlier, it may actually be integrating commercial technology with open source. And that open source material may have some variations that could allow unauthorized access into the system. Backdoors are usually part of the process when you're programming and putting together an application, and the backdoor is there so that you can test things. And then later on, you go in and you actually remove the code and it no longer works, right? You compile the exe, everything works as it's supposed to. But here's the problem. Some programmers are lazy, and all they do is they put a comment in front of the code to where it doesn't compile the same way when it goes through. So if you use certain things like JavaScript, which operate on what's called JIT, or just-in-time compiling, then that means that the source code is still present and can run. And if somebody's able to turn off those comments, they can see, oh, hey, there's a backdoor here. There's an easy access point to be able to break into this software. So here we got a couple of graphics. Figure 9.3 shows a basic DOS. Figure 9.4 shows us a more complex DDoS. And again, we can kind of see the consolidation of resources here. We have a single attacker that's talking to the zombies, and then the zombies are able to perform a SYN flood. And then I want you to take a note at figure 9.4's graphic for the attacker. There's also a listing that says infected PC. So we can create a hierarchy with a distributed denial of service system to where we can have one computer that handles maybe 50. Each of those 50 computers is able to handle another 50, and so on and so forth. Distributing basically obfuscates the original source of the attacker commands. Here we can see a DRDOS using ping, which is basically just bouncing these spoofed echo requests off of an uninfected computer in order to try and carry out the ping flood. Ping of death, as it's sometimes called. The attacker or infected PC carrying off a DRDOS with DNS on the right, figure 9.6. Same idea. We're going to spoof a DNS request to an open DNS resolver and say, hey, I'm this web server over here, and I need a response for X, Y, or Z website. And that single request is going to end up with a bunch of authoritative responses, a bunch of secondary responses, a bunch of CNAME, 4A, mail exchange, all of these different things coming through, and it's going to flood this web server. And again, because it can be distributed, you can see that the danger to a web server that's unprotected from these types of things is very great indeed. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort to start causing problems for someone else. Now let's talk about malware risks in general. Malware is just a contraction of the terms malicious software. These are pieces of software designed to intrude upon or harm your system or resources. So this could be things like a virus, a worm, a Trojan horse, a bot, ransomware. There's a ton of different ones that exist that are subcategories of these main 5, but this is kind of how it works. A virus is a replication-dependent infection machine. All it's trying to do is spread itself far and wide as much as it can, but it requires human action to do so. So you have to open a file, send an email, switch out a flash drive, right? You also have what are called Trojan horses. This is where you can have a virus that does not replicate. This is actually kind of a weird one. It relies on the fact that whatever file it's being hosted by, whatever the lure, whatever the Trojan horse itself actually is, looks attractive. It's something that you would want for your machine, but it can harm your system once it's inside by running a piece of modified code. Worms are going to be kind of the inverse of a virus in that they're all about spreading, but they can run independently, they can be remote controlled, they can have a lot of sub packages that can perform various things across a network. Bots are automated. You know, robot, just you push the button and it goes. But you don't have to push the button to start or stop it. You can just go ahead and set it out into the world, and based on predetermined conditions, it will just start engaging in whatever activity it was programmed to handle. So that could be attacking systems, destroying data, launching objectionable content, launching DOS attacks, controlling DOS attacks, or opening backdoors for further infestation. Opening backdoors is actually something that Trojans tend to do as well. So that may be kind of a cross-platform there. And then, of course, ransomware. Ransomware comes in 2 flavors. You've got true ransomware, which is where your system is actually locked until you have paid a ransom of some kind, or you may have what's called scareware, which is where the ransom is false. It's basically somebody trying to spook you into making a particular set of actions. Now, if we look here at figure 9-9, we can actually see this version of the Jigsaw ransomware is threatening to send all of your contact information, all of your logins, all that stuff to various people. Now, is that necessarily legitimate? Well, it depends, because people will sometimes impersonate legitimate malware by trying to copy various things without actually doing it. As you can see here, this is something that was written as in Visual Basic, very easy to work with. So there's a lot of different actions that you could try and carry out. There's a timer, you know, all these various things. If you get a chance, take a look. I mean, some ransomware is very, very aggressive. Some of it is not. Just depends. So if you ever see something like this, you know, be very aware. What I would traditionally do is go ahead and, you know, generally I would say cut your losses and go ahead and try and reboot. The best part is to never get infected in the first place, but sometimes it's kind of unavoidable depending on what type of activities you're engaged in. Malware characteristics, usually there's 4 big ones. Encryption, you know, trying to hide itself. Stealth, same idea, but this is disguise rather than encoding. Polymorphism, which is where it can change whenever it transfers to a new system or based on time. Time dependence can also make sure that not only polymorphism is the case, but you can have things that will activate on a particular time or date, remaining harmless and dormant until that time arrives. A variation of this is what's called a logic bomb, which is where certain conditions must be present in order for the program to start. Malware can, of course, exhibit more than one of these characteristics simultaneously. Now let's take a look at security assessments and the tools that we use to carry them out. Different types of organizations have different levels of network security risk. As such, there's different types of observations and assessments that need to be carried out. A posture assessment is something we should do annually, where a thorough examination of each network aspect to determine how it might be compromised should be performed. On the other hand, you might have what's called a security audit, and this is just where a company accredited by a network security standards agency will come by and perform an assessment. Now, this may or may not include what's called a penetration test. The security audit may just be essentially a glorified vulnerability scan. Those won't usually be too expensive. But if you're going for the full pen test, you're probably going to drop a couple of grand. Again, it only needs to be done once a year, but it may save you millions in the long run. During a posture assessment, your testing crew will actually use a lot of the methods that a hacker will in order to identify cracks in the security architecture. Now, this is an important thing to identify, something you're told very, very, very early and very often as a certified ethical hacker is think like an attacker, think like one of the bad guys. And this is because if you don't use the same tools and use the same logic, you're going to leave yourself blind to a lot of things that could go wrong. There are 3 different types of attack simulations that we can run. Vulnerability scanning, as I said, authenticated and unauthenticated are the 2 variations here. Authenticated is where you're a trusted user and you're trying to make manipulations on the inside. This is a spoon feeding exercise. Unauthenticated vulnerability scanning is where you start from the outside looking for vulnerabilities to exploit. Another way to refer to this is white box, black box, and gray box. And it follows the same logic as white hat, black hat, and gray hat. So either you're given full listings of what everything is on the inside of the network, you're given none of it, or you're given a measure of how some things work. Now, this may depend on whether or not they're trying to simulate, hey, if somebody steals our garbage after we install a new server and they get the service manual for it and they're like, hey, we know they have this particular item, let's look up vulnerabilities relative to that, then that would be a gray box situation. Penetration testing. This is where we use variable tools to find network vulnerabilities in order to exploit them. So I talked about pen testing just a moment ago. It is very expensive. It is very time consuming. It usually takes about a week to carry out, with prep time and everything else. But it is very worth it, especially if you do a lot of electronic commerce. Red team, blue team exercises. This is where we have a red team conducting the attack and a blue team attempting to defend. This is really good for clients who want to make sure that not only are they strong against external attacks, but they're also going to be well equipped to have people on their staff that are security aware. Have a strong sense of security culture, strong sense of hacker culture, ethical hacker, of course. And a lot of these people are going to be what are called purple team members, which is where they can do both, switch hitters, if you will. Now, scanning tools can be used to discover crucial information such as what hosts are on your network, what services are running, including applications and versions, what OSs are running, what ports are open, closed, or filtered, the existence, type, placement, and configuration of firewalls, be they dedicated or software-based, different types of software configurations, and in some cases, it can even find data that is unencrypted. So again, depending on whether or not you have DLP present or similar, it can be difficult sometimes to be able to locate what the actual origin point is. Now, there are 3 popular tools that we tend to talk about when you're getting introduced to the whole hacking game, if you will. There's a lot of them out there. I had to learn probably about 120 different tools by the time I got my CEH. I didn't go in depth with all of them, but I was aware of what they all did by name. I studied really, really hard for that exam, so I went, neck deep and all that stuff. And there's a ton of different equipment that's out there. There's command line stuff, there's GUI stuff, there's entire suites of things. But the big ones that you're going to see are Metasploit, Nessus, and Nmap. Now, Nmap, of course, has a GUI-based version called ZenMap. So Nmap and ZenMap are the same thing in terms of the functionality. It's just whether or not you're going to see a graphical interface or a command line interface. Nessus is a little bit more sophisticated with Nmap. It pairs well with things like Hydra, a couple of different tools in that way. Nessus is not built for large networks like Nmap is, but it does provide slightly more in-depth scans. And then Metasploit is based on cracking Windows systems for the most part. It combines known scanning and exploit techniques to explore potentially new attack routes, and it can be built in package form. So you can actually set it up to say, hey, we're going to go ahead and use, X, Y, or Z in order to try and break this. Honeypots and honey nets. Honeypot is a decoy. It's purposefully vulnerable, trying to entice hackers to go in. It may purport to be a server or some kind of storage location, or it may appear to have a lot of protection protocols on it, but they're all out of date, which would be easy to break, especially if you use like a poodle attack. Poodle is where you're attacking. I want to say it's TLS. And essentially you're trying to walk the system back to using a deprecated version. It's called walking the dog, trying to get it to go back to an older version, which could be easier to break. And then a honey net is just a group of honey pots that are linked together. Now, honey pots and honey nuts are very common to drop into what's called a DMZ, demilitarized zone between two firewalls, in order to attract automated tools. Physical security. Oh yes. It's often left out of most people's conversations about how important physical security is, because everybody's thinking, oh, hackers come through the internet. Sometimes people may actually try and sneak inside the front door dressed as a repairman or a painter or a survey person. Who knows? So physical security means we should restrict physical access to critical components and have observation in order to make sure that only authorized persons are going to the correct areas. Only trusted networking staff should have access to secure computer and data rooms. There needs to be a hierarchy so that in order to make something happen, it's not just anybody who has a key. You have to have the key, you have to have the password, you have to have the correct authorization. Maybe it has to be the correct time of day. You can actually have time of day stuff to lock people out if you're really that paranoid about it. Preventative measures such as a simple locked door can make it so much more difficult for people to get into areas in which they have no authorization to be. It's also important to make sure that when someone breaches a perimeter, we have detection methods to be able to alert us. If somebody's just lost and they try and open the wrong door, that's one thing. But if we don't even check, then the possibility is that that person has malicious intent and that they are trying to breach a secured perimeter, which is very much something we want to avoid. Now, security policy should define who has access to a computer room. There's a ton of different access controls out there. You can use keypad locks or cipher locks, or you actually have to put in a code. Key fobs, like you have for remote access for a car. You can have these for locks and other security systems. You can use RFID. You can use proximity cards, which you would use not only RFID but NFC in certain cases. Access badges, biometrics. Biometrics scan 5 different things. The big 3 things that we look for are knowledge, identity, and a physical token. So what you have, what you are, and what you know. Here we can see a badge access system on the left. That badge reader is in front of any room in which somebody would need to get into a secured place. 914. The proximity card doesn't actually require physical contact, even though people do tap it on there. It's usually within a radius of about anywhere from about 4 inches up to about 6 feet in certain cases. Depends on what type of access it is. Fingerprint scanners. Fingerprint scanners actually don't scan your entire fingerprint. They look for specific mark points on your fingertip to see whether or not they're a ridge, a whorl, or some kind of identifying mark there. So it's just looking for specific points. Detecting physical intrusion. Motion detection, of course, a lot of infrared for that. Video surveillance, tamper detection, so you can look for temperature changes, contact voltage points between 2 strike plates on a door, certain kinds of radiation, input frequency, motion sensors, whether or not something has kinetic motion applied. Asset tracking, so you can have things that have RFID tags that are the size of a grain of rice. You can have much larger tracking tokens on pallets. You can have LoJack on laptops, switches, things like that. Here we have a single-use plastic security seal. This is something that's actually pretty common. Inside of that security seal, specifically the stem that you see passing through that padlock hole, that is a metal tube. So essentially the idea is that you come through with a bolt cutter or similar and you cut it, and you can use that to open up the meter and make modifications, things like that. but you don't have something to reseal it with. So the seal has a stamped serial number on it, so whenever somebody opens it up, they have to make a note, clip the seal, replace the seal, and then sometimes turn the old seal back in order to verify that it was destroyed. On the right-hand side, you can see an RFID label, which is kind of that white stripy thing. You can see there's the kind of like loopy wiring coming off of the two ends. There is a little circuit in there, and the loopy bits that you see, the majority of an RFID label, is actually the antenna. And as that box passes by a particular location, it will automatically trigger to say, hey, I'm migrating from one place to another. This is a big part of how UPS, FedEx, and the United States Postal Service keep track of where boxes are. Now, when we're planning for physical security, we need to ask some questions. Which rooms contain critical systems? By what means would an intruder gain access? To what extent are authorized personnel granted entry, and how does it occur? Are employees instructed to ensure security after leaving or entering a secured area? Do they make sure the door closes? Is there a physical lock that they need to turn? Are authentication methods difficult to forge? Remember that there's an inversely proportional relationship between security and convenience. So the more convenient something is to use, the less secure it actually is in most cases. So we need to make sure we're keeping an eye on that. Do security personnel or supervisors thereof make periodic physical checks? What we used to do when I was in a security guard position was we would just jiggle doorknobs, make sure that doors weren't being forced, nothing was weird, no lights were left on that shouldn't be. And we were on a regular patrol, but we would vary the patrol schedule week by week so we could make sure that people weren't trying to predict where we were. We had multiple guards that were present. We had security cameras. We had pressure sensors in certain rooms. It was pretty aggressive. Are all combinations, codes, and other access protected at all times? Meaning that there's not just this big, legal pad that somebody has all this stuff written on. Are these combinations changed frequently? Are people going to have a list of combinations that are not considered acceptable? We're going to go into this a little bit more detail with passwords specifically, but if we're talking about passcodes or other access methods, we need to make sure we're following the same protocols that we would use for password security. No PII, no repeatable patterns, no sequences of numbers or letters. Last but not least, what's the plan for documenting and responding to a physical breach? Not only do we need to have good preparation beforehand, we need to have a response for during a crisis as well as after. Device hardening. These are just steps to secure a device from network or software supported attacks. This is providing multiple layers of defense so that if one layer fails, we don't automatically allow access to a sensitive or protected piece of equipment. Updates and security patches. Updates, of course, may include bug fixes, add new features, close security gaps, but with all good intentions, of course, they may inadvertently add issues as well. Something I read about just today is that Fallout 3 just got an update from Steam that no longer requires the Games for Windows live service to execute whenever you're trying to run the game. The reason it's a problem is that if you have already modified your game or you're using the Fallout script extender, the version number has changed. And because it's been so long since the last update, it may take a while before a modified version of the script extender comes out in order to allow access again. So, the revision process is something that we always have to be aware of. Are we creating more issues? Are we actually fixing the problem? Are we putting a Band-Aid on it? That sort of thing. Something else to be aware of is the process of properly managing and applying security patches. So discovery of the patch, standardization, layered security. Again, we have that multi-phasic approach to make sure that we don't have failure from lack of hardening, also sometimes called defense in depth. Vulnerability reporting, implementation, assessment, and of course risk mitigation. What do we do when a risk has been identified? Administrative credentials. This is one that's really important because, as I talked about earlier, you don't want there to be just one target that somebody can go for and then all of a sudden they have access to everything internally. And it's very hard to try and stop that. So many devices are managed via remote access connections. SSH keys are more secure than passwords as they're more difficult to crack, but they're also a lot harder to replace in the event of an incident. They're not exactly something you can just carry around. So again, security and convenience are not comfortable bedfellows. Many devices offer the option to configure several administrative accounts with varying levels of access. So you can say, you know, admin 1 has this level of access, admin 2 has slightly more, admin 3 has more access than 1 in one area, but less than 2 in another. So, you know, you can kind of have check boxes as to what they have the ability to modify. The most privileged account type for a privileged user, there are different security precautions we need to involve: limited use, location, duration, access, and privacy. So they can only use it X number of times or for X amount of time. They can only use it while they're on a physical site. You know, VPNs can of course enhance or in some cases make this a little bit more of a threat. Access, of course, you know, what can they get into, what can they not? In certain cases, they may need to request physical access through another employee. And then, of course, limited privacy, meaning that the transactions that they're carrying out are going to be very visible in order to make sure that they can be correctly monitored. Services and protocols. So we talked about earlier things like FTP and HTTP. Any service or protocol that is considered to be insecure or is known to be insecure should be disabled wherever possible. So to protect devices, let's take a look at how we deal with this. Of course, let's involve secure protocols instead of insecure where possible. Any service that you don't need should be turned off. And that's true of your home computer, not just in the business world. Minimize the number of startup programs. Close TCP/IP ports on the local firewall that are not used for ongoing activities. Disable unneeded connection technologies. So if you don't need Bluetooth, turn it off, that sort of thing. If you're on a wired connection only, turn off the Wi-Fi. If you don't need a connection to a particular network anymore, go ahead and remove it. And any applications that are no longer needed should be uninstalled. In some cases, people are a bit more extreme with this, to where they re-image their machine using something like Deep Freeze from Phoronix or similar in order to make sure that the system is absolutely squeaky clean on every boot. Hashing. Hashing is the process of taking a particular input and producing an output that is a fixed size at every time based on what version of hashing you're using. So it transforms data via an algorithm that reduces the amount of space that we need for that data in question. SHA, or secure hash algorithm, is the most common one that we use. It's very resistant to collisions, which is where we have two files that are different that produce the same hash. Different versions that we might see would be SHA 0, 1, 2, or 3. 2 and 3 are actually often implemented together for increased security. Remember, we talked about the whole layering concept, defense in depth. Effective anti-malware protection. Now, of course, this requires multiple layers, as we've discussed. An appropriate program, constant vigilance, continual updating, and educating users. That last one is probably the most critical, because no matter how well you get the system set up, no matter how well the machines behave, you still have people. And if people aren't aware of how important security is, they won't necessarily make good decisions every time. If you impress upon them how important it is, if you put some penalties in the way, then of course we can probably have a much better expectation of success. Malware leaves evidence. You know, sometimes the evidence is very minor, but there are fingerprints that are left. So in certain cases, you know, hackers may not care, and other times they may be much more aware of, hey, I need to go ahead and get this cleaned up so that way they can't trace it back to me or my group or what have you. Some of these evidence pieces are only detectable via anti-malware software because the fingerprints, digitally speaking, are so tiny, or because they could be much more generic unless correctly identified. The key of where to put this kind of software into place is understanding the location, how things are involved. Do we want to make sure that it's at the host level? We only want that one machine to have this type of protection. If we have it at the server level, multiple machines may access it, but it protects the source of the data or email or what have you. Do we want to protect it at the MDF, the main distribution frame for the network? Meaning that anything that comes in the network, be it for a host, be it for a infrastructure device, be it for a server, is going to pass through. Then if we have a cloud-based system, completely external observation, how is that regulated? How is that administrated, et cetera? What does it monitor at all times? What does it maybe miss? And the idea is usually having more than one layer to focus on these things. Again, defense in depth, very important topic. We want to balance protection and performance. The impact of a malware system on performance can be very severe in certain cases, especially if we're very rigid about how much observation and how much involvement our malware has. So malware can, of course, be identified by its effects. File sizes change, significant performance decline with no major explanation, unusual error messages, constant rebooting, quality fluctuations in display. You may have things where, all of a sudden your desktop changes languages, your monitor may be flipped upside down, the system is reporting less memory than is actually physically there, hard drives are starting to fill up all of a sudden, network traffic is constantly running at a very large rate, things of that nature. So in order to help prevent that and make sure we have that strong sense of user education, we need to get into security policies. So a policy is what identifies the goals, risks, authority levels, and team members, as well as a designated coordinator for the security of the company or organization. It talks about responsibilities for each team member as well as individual employees, and how to address a breach. How do we deal with it beforehand, during, and after? Things that are not included in the policy would be things like hardware, software, architecture, and protocols. We don't want these laid out directly in a security policy for a user because that can create a larger amount of vulnerability. We also don't want to include configuration details in this type of policy because, again, it leaves you way too open. So if you have this kind of stuff written down, it needs to be in an administrative policy, not in a user-based policy. The typical goals for security policies are that all authorized users have appropriate resource access. We want to make sure that only authorized users can get in, only authorized users can access the correct level of sensitive data, hardware and software will not be damaged either by an accident or intent, volition of malice, creating a secure environment that can both withstand and respond to a threat as well as recovering from it afterwards, communicating employee expectations and responsibilities, as well as protections for them. Remember that a security policy doesn't just protect the company in terms of finances and things like that. It can also be there in order to protect employees, so that if something was spoofed and the employee has evidence that they didn't do whatever it was, it's a process called non-repudiation, basically saying, did it originate from this place? No. Can we prove it? That sort of thing. Repudiation is basically just the ability to say, I didn't do it, and then the burden of proof can shift in certain cases. We can also have employees sign a consent to monitoring form, which allows us access to much more vigorous security methods, especially when we start to talk about what's called BYOD, or bring your own device. Our strategy is to use consensus. We want to get as many decision makers as possible involved and form a committee. And then the security coordinator we just talked about a little bit ago will be used to drive the creation of the policy. So it won't just be one person's decision, but there will be one unifying overview. You have somebody who's kind of leading the crowd. They listen to the opinions of all involved, they take a vote, they bring in, okay, this is something that's critical, this is something that's not so critical, and then the coordinator is able to say, all right, I think we have a framework. We can also make sure through a security policy that people understand the potential for damages. The posture assessment helps us to see where the holes are, where the gaps are of each threat, and what the likelihood is. If a particular threat is, inevitable, we need to make changes based on that. If it's something that's very unlikely, obviously we need to be aware of it, but it's not something we need to be sitting there biting our fingernails over every day. So BYOD, as I said, is a major concern for technology right now, bringing people in and being able to allow them multiple avenues of access to privileged resources. BYOD is, in short, the practice of allowing people to bring personal technology into a facility to perform professional responsibilities. Now, there are some variations of this that don't involve devices specifically, but things like bring your own application, bring your own cloud, bring your own tech, or choose your own device. So instead of BYOD, where you already have one, choose your own device, which is where the company supplies you a device based on your job description. So they may give you a particular model of cell phone, they may give you a tablet, they may give you a smart device for authentication purposes. You never know. It just depends on the company. Security and legal compliance must be sufficiently addressed in clearly defined BYOD policies. So again, as I said a little bit ago, you want to make it very clear. The BYOD is to not only make it easier for employees, but to make it easier for the company to say, okay, we've got you listed as, in possession of this device, which is set up for access to this particular company resource. It's been encrypted, we have it synchronized, and we have remote control of the device if we need to wipe it. So if those policies are clearly established, it sets an expectation for the employee that, okay, if something goes wrong and I have data on my phone that is breached, even if it's not directly from my device, it may end up getting remotely wiped. So again, we want to make sure that that expectation is established early so that people aren't like, well, the last voicemail I had from my mother before she died was on there, or something similar. When I was working for, again, unnamed electronics retailer, I worked in the cell phone department, and I had to deal with making sure that people's data was transferred efficiently, effectively, and completely, so that way they didn't lose anything as they were moving from device to device. And it was a real challenge sometimes. BYOD may include onboard and offboard procedures, which is where you bring a device into and remove a device from your network. Now, this can be handled automatically by creating policies inside of what's called MDM, or Mobile Device Management. MDM can automate enrollment of an employee adding their device to a network or using any of the other BYOD variations. It can also enforce password policies, various other policy-based restrictions, encrypting data, synchronizing data, remote wiping. Samsung's really big on this with their Knox platform. Samsung approved for enterprise. Safe allows for remote wiping, access encryption, and policy enforcement. It can also monitor device location and communications. So be aware, BYOD is nice, but it gives a lot of visibility to your employer. So you have to make sure, again, what are the restrictions and protections that are in place for you as an employee. The same way we talk about think like an attacker for ethical hacking, we also have to be able to think like not only a company, but as an employee for the purposes of BYOD enforcement. The Acceptable Use Policy, or AUP. This is going to explain to users what they can and can't do while accessing network resources. It can explain penalties for violations, and it likely describes how this protects network security. There's a ton of restrictions here. I'm not going to read through all of them for you. I know you guys can read, but the general idea is, think if your boss was standing over your shoulder all day. That's how we would expect you to behave in terms of the choices that you make. Do things that are legal, ethical, and in the best interest of the company. Make sure you sign out. Make sure that you don't share your password with people. Make sure you're not sharing company data or customer data, things like that. NDAs. NDAs, of course, are big in tech startups because there's a lot of proprietary information going on. Somebody's trying to find a way to reinvent the wheel, and they want to make sure that nobody steals that idea and tries to go forward with it. So NDAs need to be able to define not only what is considered acceptable or unacceptable behavior, but it also needs to make it very clear what confidential and private means to the organization. In environments like a hospital where there's a ton of sensitive data or confidential data being involved, policies should classify information in degrees of sensitivity, and it should have a corroboration of how strictly access is going to be regulated. So if we have very sensitive information, we want to make sure that the regulation of that is strictly enforced, that penalties are clearly identified, and that separations are in place. Separations of job duties and job rotation and co-authoring or verification of items by using more than one employee, multi-factor authentication resources, etc. Security can be a very expensive business, but again, it's an investment. It's making sure that we don't leave ourselves vulnerable to very negative consequences on the back end. Password policy. If there was ever a slide that I would say that this is a good one to grab a screenshot of or to make notations, these are things that will work in your daily life as well as in your professional life. Passwords should always be secure because they're a primary method for access, and we are working towards a password-free future because passwords are so inherently weak. They rely on human memory. They rely on being able to be hashed and stored. So we're moving towards more multi-authentication, tokens and things that we can use like biometrics in order to try and identify a user much more vigorously. But until then, passwords are still going to be the name of the game. So here's some tips. Always change your system defaults. Never leave system defaults in place. It's a bad idea. Even if they're randomly generated, the algorithm that's used to randomly generate them may be breached in the future, which means, hey, your randomly generated password can now be cracked by the basis of a couple of different criteria that are present. Never use PII. Personally identifiable information, things like your name, your nickname, your date of birth, parts of your social security number, your pet's name, your favorite book, your kids' birthdays, the first car you ever drove. Don't use dictionary words. If it's something that would appear in the dictionary normally, that dictionary can be digitized and fed into a password cracker. Your password should, of course, have greater length than 8 characters without repeating words, numbers, or other discernible patterns. Don't use a single letter, number, or symbol more than twice in succession. No easily recognized phrases. Don't write your password down or share it with others. Change your password every 60 days at least, possibly more frequently if you can manage it. After a password has expired, discard it. Do not consider it for reuse because at that point, it is now part of the list of items that could be used to breach your information. Use passwords for different applications differently. Of course, we don't want to necessarily have any repeats. That's probably the one that most people are guilty of, to where they will go in and say, I'm going to use, trying to think of something that's random. I'll look at something on my desk. Satisfaction guarantee 2, satisfaction guarantee 3, satisfaction guarantee 3 exclamation point. These are all things that help to make the passwords different enough to where most password qualifiers would say, okay, that's different enough, you can use that password. But if somebody has a rainbow table set up or is already salting it based on their knowledge that you always use satisfaction guarantee as part of your password, that could probably speed up their cracking process pretty significantly. If you need to create a lot of different passwords and it's difficult for you to keep track of them all, because human memory is pretty fallible. There's a lot of different password management softwares that are out there. I was really kind of saddened to see that LastPass had gone for a paid subscription model now, but I'm sure somebody else will come up with a similar product in the future. So of course, just keep your eyes open for that. Be aware of the limitations of things like Keychain if you use iOS, or Firefox Sync, or any program that allows you to store passwords for use at an automated fashion, because that automatic access could be used against you. Privileged user agreement or privileged access agreement, so called a PUA or a PA. This is going to address specific concerns related to privileged access as given to system administrators and to support staff. Administrative staff in certain cases. So we want to make sure that we're aware that whenever somebody has a particular access level, that we have an agreement that states if this is violated and you're found to be in breach of contract or things like that, you can be subject to this. Or, these are the qualifications that you must do in order to make sure that your password is in compliance every 30 days, 60 days. Password has to be this long. Usually much more restrictive than a standard user policy. When accessing a privileged account, you should only stay signed in as long as you need to perform the task that is being done, and then sign back off. So if you're using an administrative account to be able to install software, sign in, do the install, sign off, or temporary credential, things like that. Privileged users need more frequent training as well as reminders to avoid falling for social engineering. So people in this level of control or level of access should be much more aware of security. They are probably going to need to be CC'd in a little bit more on security platform or posture meetings. And privileged accounts can also be monitored via what's called a PAM, Privileged Account Management Tool. So that's a handy way to make sure that their activity falls in step with what is expected for their particular access level. A lot of this is based on what's called heuristics. Heuristics is a behavior-based analysis model, so that way you can see whether or not somebody's behavior is trending towards a particular hazard. Anti-malware policy. Anti-malware provides rules for using anti-malware software and rules for how we install programs, how we share files, and using external storage. All of these are considered major points of vulnerability, so your anti-malware policy needs to include these guidelines. Every computer should be equipped with some form of detection and removal software. Users should not be allowed to alter or disable the software. Users should know what to do if the anti-malware program triggers. And an anti-malware team should focus on maintaining these measures. Usually it's just automated updates with signatures and things like that. Users should be prohibited from installing any unauthorized software on their systems, and system-wide alerts should be issued to network users notifying them of serious threats and how to prevent infection. So as you can see from this chapter, a lot of what we talk about is establishing a clear set of rules and expectations, as well as establishing response methodologies. How do we deal with the day-to-day activities? Okay, well, here's the rules. How do we deal with a particular threat? Here's the rules. What do we do after the threat has passed? Here's the rules. That's what you want to see as a technician. That's what you want to see as a security engineer. That's what you want to see as an IT staff member at any level, is that somebody has sat down and thought about the major items that are likely to occur. And these documents should be living, so that way, over time, if something goes completely haywire, we have the ability to say, okay, we've experienced this once, we have some new stuff in place to say if this happens again, we're not going to get hit as hard, if at all. Important safety tip, learn from your mistakes. So that is Chapter 9. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I certainly appreciate your time and attention. If you have any questions or concerns, as per usual, you can contact me via the usual places. You can contact me directly through here on YouTube. You can contact me through Blackboard. You can contact me through my Google Voice number. And then, of course, you can always come by my office hours if you wish. It has been my pleasure to sit and go over this with you, and I hope I have expanded your knowledge in terms of security and protection, how we deal with physical and non-physical security. And as always, stay safe, and I will see you next class.